Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, Martha and Samuel Chen had made peace with their solitude. For 43 years they'd tended their remote cabin, their marriage bound together by shared grief. 5 miscarriages, 3 failed adoptions, and the slow acceptance that parenthood would never be theirs. Then the blizzard hit. Through the howling wind, they heard pounding on their door. Outside stood a young woman, 9 months pregnant, bleeding, and speaking in frantic whispers about them finding her. Martha's midwife instincts from decades ago kicked in as the woman collapsed into labor. But as Samuel helped deliver the baby in their candlelit kitchen, the woman whispered something that made his blood freeze. "They killed my husband for this child. Now they'll kill anyone who helps me." The couple soon realized this wasn't just about offering shelter to a stranger. Hidden in the woman's belongings were documents that revealed a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government, and the baby she'd just delivered wasn't entirely human. What price would Martha and Samuel pay for the child they'd always dreamed of? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman, who had given her name only as Elena, lay unconscious on their bed, her dark hair matted with sweat and snow. The baby, impossibly quiet since birth, rested in Martha's arms. In the amber glow of the oil lamp, something seemed different about the infant's eyes. They were too alert, too knowing for a newborn. Samuel returned from the kitchen with hot water and clean towels, his weathered hands shaking slightly. At 72, he thought he'd seen everything the mountain could throw at him, but this night felt different, wrong somehow. "The bleeding stopped," Martha whispered, checking Elena's pulse. Even at 68, her nursing training from 5 decades ago remained sharp. "But she's exhausted. We need to let her sleep." The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a musical note. Martha looked down and gasped. For just a moment the child's eyes had seemed to glow with an inner light, but when she blinked and looked again, they appeared normal. "Did you see?" she began. "I saw," Samuel said grimly. He moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. The blizzard showed no signs of letting up, but something else caught his attention. Tracks in the snow, not Elena's stumbling footprints, but deliberate, measured steps that circled their cabin before disappearing into the tree line. "Someone followed her," he said. Martha clutched the baby closer. In this weather? Impossible. But Samuel knew these mountains better than anyone. No ordinary person would be out in conditions like this, which meant whoever was tracking Elena was far from ordinary. A manila envelope had fallen from Elena's torn jacket when they'd helped her inside. Now it lay on the kitchen table, sealed but bulging with contents. Samuel stared at it, knowing that opening it would cross a line they couldn't uncross. "We should look," Martha said quietly, reading his thoughts. "Should we? She trusted us enough to collapse on our doorstep. Maybe that's enough." Martha studied the sleeping woman's face. Young, maybe 25, with a kind of exhaustion that spoke of weeks of running. "She said they killed her husband. For this baby." They looked down at the infant again. Beautiful, perfect, but there was something else. The child hadn't cried once since birth, hadn't made any of the normal newborn sounds, and those eyes. Samuel made the decision for both of them. He broke the envelope's seal and spread the contents across the table. Photographs, medical reports, government letterheads with classifications they'd only seen in movies. The documents painted an impossible picture. Genetic modification, human experimentation, something called Project Chimera. One photograph made Martha's breath catch. It showed Elena in a hospital gown, her belly barely showing pregnancy, connected to machines they couldn't identify. The timestamp was only 4 months ago. "This can't be right," Martha whispered. "Pregnancies don't work like this." But the evidence was undeniable. The baby in her arms had somehow developed from conception to birth in 4 months, and according to the medical reports, Elena's child carried genetic markers that weren't entirely human. A sound from outside made them both freeze. the distant rumble of engines fighting through the storm. Vehicle engines. Samuel quickly gathered the documents while Martha wrapped the baby in warmer blankets. Elena stirred, her eyes fluttering open with a panic that spoke of too many nights running. "They're here," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I brought this to you." The engines grew louder. Through the storm they could see lights cutting through the darkness, powerful spotlights that swept the mountainside with military precision. Martha looked at the baby in her arms, then at Samuel. In 43 years of marriage, they'd never needed words to understand each other. They had minutes to decide: surrender Elena and the child to whoever hunted them, or protect the family they'd never thought they'd have. The lights grew brighter. The woman's eyes fluttered open as Martha pressed a warm cloth to her forehead. For a moment, those pale blue irises darted frantically around the unfamiliar room, taking in the rough-hewn log walls, the crackling fireplace, and the two weathered faces hovering above her with concern. "Easy now," Martha whispered, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had once dreamed of soothing fevered children. "You're safe. You're in our home." The stranger tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent obvious pain through her swollen belly. Frank stepped forward, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped adjust the pillows behind her back. "Don't push yourself. You took quite a beating out there." "The storm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember. My car went off the road." Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and relief flooded her features when she felt the familiar roundness there. "The baby seems fine," Martha assured her, though she made a mental note to call Doc Henderson once the phone lines were working again. "Strong heartbeat from what I can tell. How far along are you?" 7 months. The woman's gaze shifted between Frank and Martha, wariness creeping into her expression. "I should go. I don't want to impose." Frank let out a bark of laughter that held no humor. "Go where? The nearest town is 40 miles down a mountain road that's buried under 3 feet of snow. You're not going anywhere for at least a week." Martha shot him a sharp look at his bluntness, but the woman just nodded slowly, as if she'd expected as much. "I'm Elena," she said finally. "Elena Cross. Martha Caldwell, and this gruff old bear is my husband Frank." Martha settled into the chair beside the bed they'd set up in the living room, studying their unexpected guest with the keen eye of someone who'd learned to read people during her years as a schoolteacher. There was something about Elena that didn't quite fit. Her clothes were expensive despite being torn by her ordeal, her manicured nails spoke of a pampered life, yet there was a haunted quality in her eyes that suggested recent trauma. "Where were you headed?" Frank asked, lowering himself into his recliner with a grunt. "Not many folks venture up this way, especially this late in the season." Elena's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Martha caught it. "North," she said vaguely. "I was driving to Seattle, to stay with my sister until—" She gestured at her belly. "Long way to go in your condition," Martha observed, "especially alone." "Sometimes alone is safer." The words slipped out before Elena could stop them, and Martha saw her immediately regret the admission. Color rose in her pale cheeks. "I mean, my husband travels for work. I didn't want to be by myself when the baby comes." Frank and Martha exchanged a glance. 43 years of marriage had taught them to communicate without words, and both recognized the signs of a woman running from something. They'd seen it before, the occasional hiker or lost tourist who found their way to the cabin carrying more than just a backpack full of supplies. "Well," Martha said carefully, "you're welcome here as long as you need. We don't get much company, especially in winter. Might be nice having someone to talk to besides this old coot." "Hey now," Frank protested, but there was affection in his voice. He turned to Elena with surprising gentleness. "Martha's right. Place gets mighty quiet. Might do us all some good." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away. "You don't even know me." "Don't need to," Frank said simply. "You're in trouble, you're carrying a baby, and there's a blizzard outside. That's all we need to know." Martha felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in decades. The sight of Elena's rounded belly, the vulnerability in her voice, the way her hand protectively cradled her unborn child, awakened something Martha had thought long buried. She'd given up, hoping years ago, had made peace with the silence that filled their home. But now, "Are you hungry?" Martha asked, rising from her chair with more energy than she'd felt in months. "I've got soup on the stove, fresh bread in the oven. I don't want to be any trouble." "Trouble?" Martha almost laughed. "Honey, I haven't had anyone to cook for besides Frank in more years than I care to count. You'd be doing me a favor." As Martha busied herself in the kitchen, she could hear Frank's low rumble as he explained about the generator, the wood stove, the way the wind howled through the canyon when storms like this one settled in. His voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard in years, and she realized he was enjoying having someone new to talk to. But beneath her growing excitement at having Elena here, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that their guest was hiding something significant. The expensive luggage Frank had retrieved from the wrecked car, the way Elena had flinched when he'd mentioned calling the authorities to report the accident, the careful way she answered even simple questions. Whatever Elena Cross was running from, Martha suspected it would follow her here eventually. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under weak sunlight. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, watching steam rise from his coffee mug as he studied the drifts that had transformed their familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Behind him, Martha moved quietly, preparing a breakfast tray with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades caring for others. "She's still sleeping," Martha whispered, though the guest room was far enough away that normal conversation wouldn't wake their visitor. Poor thing must have been exhausted. Thomas nodded, but something nagged at him. In 40 years of mountain living, he'd learned to read storms and the people they sometimes delivered to his doorstep. Lost hikers usually carried gear, even inadequate gear. They had identification, cell phones dead from cold, stories about where they'd started and where they'd been headed. This woman had appeared with nothing but the clothes on her back and a belly full of child. "Tom?" Martha's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I said breakfast is ready." He turned to find her holding the tray, and the sight of her careful preparations, the good china, the cloth napkin, the small vase with dried flowers from last summer's garden, made his chest tight. Martha had always been a nurturer, but their childless years had given her maternal instincts nowhere to flow except toward him, their few neighbors, and the occasional stranded traveler. "Let me take it up," he offered, but Martha was already heading toward the stairs. "She might be more comfortable with another woman," Martha replied, and Thomas recognized the hope threading through her practical words. He followed at a distance, close enough to help if needed, far enough to respect Martha's desire to handle this herself. The floorboards creaked under their feet, a familiar percussion that had marked their mornings for decades. Martha knocked softly on the guest room door. "Hello, dear. I've brought you some breakfast." A rustling from within, then a voice, still thick with sleep, "Come in." Thomas lingered in the hallway as Martha entered. Through the crack in the door, he caught a glimpse of their guest sitting up in bed, dark hair tangled around her shoulders, one hand resting protectively over her rounded stomach. In daylight, she looked even younger than he'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of pale skin that suggested she wasn't accustomed to outdoor life. "How are you feeling this morning?" Martha asked, settling the tray across the woman's lap with practiced ease. "Better. Much better, thank you." The voice carried a slight accent, something Thomas couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Nonsense," Martha replied, but Thomas heard the pleasure in her tone. "I'm just glad we found you. What's your name, dear?" A pause, just long enough to be noticeable. "Sarah. Sarah Chen." Thomas frowned. The hesitation was subtle, but it was there. In his years working search and rescue, he'd learned that people told the truth quickly or lied with pauses. "That's a lovely name," Martha was saying. "And when is your baby due?" "Soon," came the reply, followed by another pause. "Very soon, I think." Thomas moved closer to the doorway. The woman, Sarah, was eating with the mechanical efficiency of someone truly hungry, but her eyes kept darting toward the window, checking the view of the mountain road that led down to town. "Sarah," Martha continued, settling into the bedside chair with the contentment of someone finally having someone to care for, "we should probably get you to a doctor. The nearest hospital is about an hour away when the roads are clear, but after last night's storm—" "No." The word came sharp and fast, cutting through Martha's gentle planning. Sarah seemed to realize her mistake immediately, because her next words came softer, accompanied by what looked like a practiced smile. "I mean, I'm fine. Really, I just need to rest a bit more." Thomas felt the familiar prickle of intuition that had kept him alive through decades of mountain rescues and harsh winters. People didn't refuse medical care when they were pregnant and stranded unless they had reasons that went beyond simple preference. "Of course, dear," Martha said, though Thomas could hear the confusion threading through her accommodating tone. "But we should at least call someone. Your family must be worried sick." Another pause, longer this time. Through the crack in the door, Thomas watched Sarah's hand move to her throat, fingers finding what looked like a thin chain before dropping away. "There's no one to call," Sarah finally said, and this time Thomas believed the emotion in her voice was genuine. "It's just me and the baby now." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Thomas saw his wife's shoulders sag slightly, recognizing the pain of shared experience. They knew about being alone, about facing life's challenges without the buffer of family, about the particular ache of isolation. "Well," Martha said, her voice thick with sudden emotion, "you're not alone now." Margaret's hands trembled as she ladled warm broth into a ceramic bowl, stealing glances at the young woman, who sat wrapped in quilts by their stone fireplace. 3 days had passed since they'd pulled her from the storm, and still she spoke only in fragments, as if words themselves might shatter her. "What's your name, dear?" Margaret asked gently, settling into the chair beside her. The woman's dark eyes flickered with something that might have been panic before she looked away. "Anna," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling logs. Her hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. "Anna Walsh." From across the room, Thomas looked up from his newspaper. Something in the woman's tone made him uneasy, though he couldn't place why. Perhaps it was the way she'd hesitated, as if testing how the name sounded in her mouth. "That's a lovely name," Margaret said, offering the bowl. "You must eat something. For the baby." Anna accepted the broth with shaking hands. Margaret noticed how she kept glancing toward the windows, even though they were thick with frost and showed nothing but white emptiness beyond. It was as if she expected something to emerge from the storm that still raged outside. "Were you traveling alone?" Thomas asked, folding his paper. "That's dangerous country out there, especially in your condition." Anna's spoon clinked against the bowl. My husband was supposed to meet me in Denver. I was trying to reach the main road when the storm hit." Margaret's heart ached at the fear in the girl's voice. She looked so young, probably not even 25, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and skin pale as birch bark. There was something fragile about her, like a bird with a broken wing. "We'll get word to him as soon as the telephone lines are repaired," Margaret assured her. "They came down in the storm, but the company usually has them fixed within a week." Anna nodded, but Thomas caught the flash of terror that crossed her features before she quickly composed herself. His instincts, honed by years of hunting and living off the land, told him there was more to this story. "Much more." "What does your husband do?" he asked casually. He travels for work." Anna set down the bowl, having barely touched the soup. "I'd like to rest now, if that's all right." Margaret immediately rose, fussing over her like a mother hen. "Of course, dear. You need your strength. The spare room is all ready for you." As Margaret helped Anna to her feet, Thomas noticed how the young woman moved, not just with the careful gait of pregnancy, but with the hyper-aware tension of someone accustomed to watching her back. It reminded him of wounded animals he'd encountered in the wild, creatures that had learned the hard, that safety was always temporary. After Anna disappeared into the spare room, Margaret busied herself clearing away the untouched soup. Thomas watched his wife's face, recognizing the light in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years, not since they'd lost hope of having children of their own. "She's frightened," Margaret murmured. "Poor thing. Being caught in that storm, separated from her husband, carrying a child. Margaret." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Be careful." She turned to face him, defensive. "Careful of what?" "She's just a girl who needs help. A girl who won't eat, won't sleep soundly, and jumps every time the wind rattles the windows. A girl whose story doesn't quite add up." Margaret's jaw tightened. Since when did helping someone in need require an interrogation, Thomas Hartwell? He saw the warning in his wife's eyes and backed down, but his unease remained. That night, as Margaret slept peacefully beside him for the first time in months, Thomas lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Through their cracked bedroom door, he watched Anna creep to the front window, pulling the curtain aside, just enough to peer out into the darkness. She stood there for nearly an hour, motionless as a sentinel, before finally returning to her room. Thomas stared at the ceiling until dawn, wondering what she was watching for, or perhaps what she was afraid might find her. When morning came, Anna emerged from her room looking even more haggard than before. She'd clearly slept little, if at all. Margaret, however, was practically glowing with purpose as she prepared an elaborate breakfast. "I thought we might work on some baby clothes today," Margaret announced cheerfully. "I have plenty of yarn, and it would be good to keep your hands busy." Anna managed a weak smile, but Thomas noticed how she positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the window. Whatever had brought her to their mountain sanctuary, he was becoming increasingly certain it wasn't just a storm. And something told him that before this was over, they'd all be tested in ways they never imagined. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that stretched across the mountain like held breath. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Walter trudge through knee-deep snow toward the barn, his movements slower than usual. The weight of their midnight conversation hung between them, unspoken but present in every careful glance, every measured word. Behind her, Elena sat at the wooden table, both hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The young woman had barely touched the eggs and toast Margaret had prepared, instead staring out at the endless white expanse with an expression that shifted between wonder and something darker, fear perhaps, or calculation. "You've never seen snow like this before," Margaret observed, settling into the chair across from her unexpected guest. Elena's laugh held a brittle edge. "Where I come from, winter means rain and maybe a frost warning on the news." She touched her belly absently, a gesture Margaret had noticed her repeat throughout the morning. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found me, but we did find you. That's what matters now." "Is it?" Elena's green eyes fixed on Margaret with startling intensity. "Sometimes being found isn't the blessing people think it is." The words sent an uncomfortable chill through Margaret. She studied the young woman more carefully, noting details that had escaped her attention in the previous evening's chaos. Elena's clothes, though dirty and torn from her ordeal, were expensive, the kind of designer pieces Margaret recognized from the magazines she sometimes bought in town. Her hands were soft, unmarked by manual labor, and despite her claims of being stranded and desperate, she wore jewelry that caught the morning light with genuine sparkle. "Elena," Margaret said carefully, "perhaps you should tell us more about how you ended up on our mountain. The nearest road is 15 miles away, and in that storm—" She let the impossibility of the situation hang in the air. Elena's fingers tightened around the mug. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was running away from something. Someone, actually." She looked down at her hands. "The father of my baby isn't... He's not a good man, Margaret. When I told him I was pregnant, he wanted me to get rid of it, said it would complicate things." "Things?" "His marriage, his business, his perfectly controlled life. Elena's voice gained strength, edged with bitterness. I thought I knew him, thought what we had was real, but when it mattered, when I needed him most, he showed me exactly who he was. Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest, the old wound of maternal longing that had never quite healed. Here was a young woman, carrying a child, abandoned and afraid. Everything Margaret had once wished she could be, minus the abandonment and fear. "So you left," Margaret said. "I took his car, just drove until the gas ran out, then kept walking." Elena met Margaret's eyes. "I know how it sounds, like I'm some kind of thief, but he owed me that much at least." Through the window, Margaret could see Walter emerging from the barn, his expression troubled. He'd been checking the radio again, she knew, listening for news, for any mention of missing persons or stolen vehicles. The doubt she'd tried to suppress came rushing back. "This man," Margaret said slowly, "he'll be looking for you, for his car." Elena nodded, her hand moving protectively to her stomach again. "Probably. He doesn't like losing things that belong to him. And the baby belongs to him." "No." The word came out sharp and fierce. "This baby belongs to me. Only me." Margaret heard Walter's boots on the porch, the familiar sound of him stomping off snow before entering. When the door opened, he brought with him the smell of cold air and something else, tension that seemed to crackle around him like static electricity. "Margaret," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Elena looked between them, her expression suddenly wary. "What is it?" Walter's eyes never left his wife's face. "Just need to discuss some practical matters, about the roads, the weather." But Margaret knew her husband well enough to recognize the tight set of his jaw, the way his fingers worked at the zipper of his jacket. This wasn't about roads or weather. This was about whatever he'd heard on that radio. She rose slowly, her heart beginning to pound. "Of course. Elena, why don't you rest? You should be taking care of yourself and the baby." As they stepped into the hallway, Walter's hand found her elbow, his grip firm but gentle. The gesture she'd once found comforting now felt like a warning, a preparation for something that would change everything they thought they knew about their mysterious guest. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, waiting for whatever truth was about to shatter their fragile moment of hope. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the morning sun, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was brewing. Martha stood at the kitchen window, her weathered hands gripping the ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Steam rose from her untouched coffee as she watched Samuel trudge through the snow toward the woodshed, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Behind her, she could hear the soft shuffle of feet on the wooden floor. The girl, Emma, she'd said her name was, moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make herself small, invisible. Martha had seen that posture before, in the mirror of her own youth, before Samuel had taught her that love didn't have to come with bruises. "Mrs. Hartwell," the voice was barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you again. For everything." Martha turned slowly, studying the young woman's face in the morning light. The swelling around her left eye had gone down considerably, but the discoloration remained, a sickly yellow-green that spoke of violence only days old. What troubled Martha more were the girl's eyes themselves, too old for her face, too careful, always calculating escape routes, even in this safe haven. "No need for thanks," Martha said, setting down her mug, "though I reckon we should talk about what comes next." Emma's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protective and fearful at once. "I don't want to be a burden. If you could just point me toward the nearest town when the road's clear." "Child, you're 7 months along if I'm any judge, and I've seen enough pregnant women to know. Where exactly do you think you're going in your condition?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke. Emma's composure cracked just slightly, and Martha glimpsed the terror beneath her carefully maintained facade. This wasn't a girl running toward something, she was running away, and whatever she was fleeing had her looking over her shoulder even here, miles from anywhere. "I can't stay," Emma whispered. "He'll find me. He always finds me. Who will find you?" But before Emma could answer, the door burst open with such force it rattled the windows. Both women jumped, Emma's face draining of color as she pressed herself against the wall. It was only Samuel, stamping snow from his boots, but the damage was done. Martha saw how the girl's entire body had gone rigid, how her breathing had become shallow and quick. "Sorry," Samuel said, noticing the tension immediately. Wind caught the door. He looked between the two women, reading the situation with the intuition of a man who had spent 40 years learning to interpret his wife's moods. "Everything all right?" Martha moved closer to Emma, whose hands were shaking now. "Samuel, maybe you could start on those fence repairs you've been putting off?" But Emma surprised them both by speaking up. "No, it's fine. I need to tell someone. I can't keep running forever." Samuel closed the door gently this time and hung his coat on the peg with deliberate care, giving the girl time to gather herself. When he turned back, his expression was patient, kind, and something in Emma's rigid posture began to soften. "His name is Marcus," she began, her voice growing steadier with each word. "My husband. He's not a good man. He owns half the businesses in Millfield, the bank, the sheriff's office, the courthouse. Everyone thinks he's this pillar of the community, this generous benefactor who rebuilt the church and funds the school programs." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd known men like that, men who wore their cruelty like a well-tailored suit hidden from public view. "The baby?" Samuel asked quietly. Emma's laugh was bitter, hollow. "He was thrilled when I got pregnant, said it would complete his perfect image. The successful businessman with his beautiful wife and child. He started planning immediately, the nursery, the christening, even which boarding schools would be suitable. He never asked what I wanted." She moved to the window, staring out at the pristine snow as if it might offer absolution. 3 weeks ago, I tried to leave, made it as far as the state line before his men found me. He brought me back, locked me in the house, said he was protecting his investment. Her hand moved to a faded bruise on her wrist. "Said he'd make sure I never ran again." Martha exchanged a look with Samuel, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd wanted a child for so long, had mourned the empty rooms and silent hallways of their home. Now here was a young woman, carrying new life, asking for the very protection they longed to provide. But they both understood that helping Emma meant more than offering shelter from a storm. It meant standing against a man with power, resources, and nothing to lose. It meant putting everything they'd built at risk. "How did you get away?" Samuel asked. Emma turned back to them, and for the first time since arriving, she almost smiled. "I killed him." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to magnify every creak of the old cabin. Martha found herself listening for sounds that weren't there, the phantom cries of a baby that existed only in her imagination, or perhaps in her deepest hopes. She stood at the kitchen window, watching Henry split firewood with methodical precision, each swing of the axe a meditation against the morning cold. Behind her, Elena sat at the worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The young woman had been unusually quiet since waking, her dark eyes following Martha's movements with an intensity that made the older woman's skin prickle. There was something calculating in that gaze, something that reminded Martha of a cat watching a bird. "You never had children," Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable domestic sounds. Martha's hands stilled on the dish rag she'd been using to clean the already spotless counter. "No, we weren't blessed that way. But you wanted them." It wasn't a question. Martha turned slowly, studying Elena's face for any hint of mockery or pity, but found neither. Instead, there was an odd hunger in the young woman's expression, as if Martha's answer might feed some deep need. More than anything, Martha admitted, surprised by her own honesty. She rarely spoke of their loss, even to Henry. The words felt rusty in her mouth. Elena nodded slowly, one hand drifting to rest on the gentle swell of her belly. "I can see it in how you move around this place. Like you're still making room for someone who never came." The observation hit Martha like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white against the porcelain. Outside, Henry's axe continued its rhythmic work, oblivious to the conversation unfolding within. "What about you?" Martha managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The baby's father. Where is he?" Elena's expression shifted, a shadow passing across her features like clouds over the sun. Her fingers tightened around the mug, and for a moment Martha thought she wouldn't answer. "Gone," Elena said finally. He can't be part of this." "Can't or won't? Does it matter?" Elena's laugh was bitter, hollow. "The result is the same. I'm alone." Martha felt her heart clench with familiar pain. She recognized that particular brand of loneliness, the ache of loving someone who couldn't or wouldn't love you back. Without thinking, she moved to the table and sat across from Elena, reaching out to cover the younger woman's free hand with her own. "You're not alone now," she said softly. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there too, something that made Martha's instincts whisper warnings she chose to ignore. Relief, perhaps, or maybe triumph. The back door banged open, letting in a rush of cold air and Henry's heavy footsteps. He stomped his boots on the mat, shrugging out of his coat as he surveyed the cozy scene before him. His eyes lingered on their joined hands, and Martha saw a flicker of something cross his face. "Concern? Caution? Roads are still impassable," he announced, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "Could be days before the plough makes it up here." "That's fine," Elena said quickly, too quickly. "I'm in no hurry." Henry's frown deepened. "Don't you have people worried about you? Family who'll be wondering where you are?" "No." The word was flat, final. "No family." Martha felt another surge of protective instinct. This poor girl, pregnant and alone, with nowhere to go and no one to care for her. It seemed like providence that the storm had blown her to their door, a gift wrapped in snow and desperation. But Henry was watching Elena with the same careful attention he gave to tracking deer through the woods. Martha knew that look, had seen it when he sensed something was wrong, a trap set by hunters or weather turning dangerous. His instincts had kept them safe for 40 years. "Funny thing," Henry said, settling into his chair with deliberate slowness. "I've been thinking about that car of yours, the one you said went off the road near Miller's Bend." Elena's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "What about it?" "Well, I drove that stretch yesterday morning before the storm hit. Didn't see any tracks, any signs of an accident. Snow was fresh, would have shown tire marks clear as day." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Martha felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop, despite the cheerful crackling of the fire. Elena's hand had gone very still beneath hers, and when Martha looked at the young woman's face, she saw a stranger looking back. "Maybe you were mistaken about the location," Martha said weakly, desperate to break the tension. Elena smiled then, and it was like watching a mask slip into place. "Maybe," she agreed, but her eyes never left Henry's face. Memory can be such a tricky thing, especially when you're scared and alone in a storm. Henry nodded slowly, but Martha could see he wasn't satisfied. Neither was she, if she was honest. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, and she felt them taking root in the fertile ground of her long-dormant fears. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the old cabin's settling bones. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas split wood with the methodical precision of a man who had performed the task 10,000 times before. Each swing of the axe carried a violence she rarely saw in her gentle husband, as if he were trying to cleave through more than just pine and oak. Sarah had been with them for 3 days now, and the girl's presence had shifted something fundamental in their quiet world. Margaret found herself humming while she cooked, planning meals for 3 instead of 2, her hands unconsciously smoothing over surfaces as if preparing a nest. But beneath this unexpected joy lurked an unease she couldn't name, a shadow that followed Sarah's every movement. The girl never spoke of the father. When asked directly, her eyes would glaze over, and she would touch her belly with a protective gesture that seemed more fearful than maternal. She had nightmares that left her gasping and calling out names Margaret couldn't quite catch through the thin walls, and there were the phone calls. Margaret had heard the hushed conversations late at night, Sarah's voice urgent and pleading into the old rotary phone in the hallway. When confronted, Sarah claimed she was calling a sister in Denver, but Margaret had lived long enough to recognize the cadence of lies. The girl was running from something or someone, and that something was following her like a persistent shadow. "She's scared," Thomas had said the night before, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Whatever put her on that road in the middle of a blizzard, it wasn't desperation for help. It was terror. Margaret had wanted to argue, to defend the story they'd been told about car trouble and missed connections, but she'd seen the way Sarah flinched when the wind rattled the windows too hard, or how she positioned herself with her back always to a wall. These were not the nervous habits of a young expectant mother, but the survival instincts of prey. The sound of Thomas's axe ceased abruptly, and Margaret watched him straighten, his attention fixed on something beyond her line of sight. A moment later she heard it too, the distant growl of an engine struggling up their mountain road. Few people knew the way to their cabin, and fewer still would brave the treacherous path in winter. Sarah appeared at Margaret's shoulder, as if summoned by the sound, her face draining of color. "Who could that be?" she whispered, but there was no curiosity in her voice, only dread. Through the trees, Margaret caught glimpses of a dark sedan, picking its way carefully along the snow-packed road. The vehicle was wrong for these mountains, too low, too clean, more suited for city streets than wilderness tracks. As it drew closer, she could make out two figures in the front seats, both wearing the kind of dark clothing that suggested official business. "Sarah," Margaret said carefully, not turning from the window, "is there something you need to tell us?" The girl's breathing had become shallow and quick. "They found me," she whispered. "I didn't think they could find me here. I was so careful." Thomas burst through the front door, snow clinging to his boots. "Sarah, get away from the windows, now!" His voice carried an authority Margaret rarely heard, a remnant perhaps of his younger days before they'd retreated to this mountain sanctuary. "Thomas, what?" "There's another car coming from the south road. They've got us boxed in." He moved to the gun cabinet, his hands steady despite the gravity in his voice. "Sarah, I need you to tell me right now, are these people here to hurt you?" The girl collapsed into a kitchen chair, her hands wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. "They're not here to hurt me," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're here for the baby." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. "What do you mean?" "The father," Sarah began, tears streaming down her face. "He's not just some boyfriend who ran off. He's married, important, he has money and influence, and when I told him about the baby, when I refused to..." She couldn't finish the sentence. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the valley, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. Thomas checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "How important?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. "Senator important," Sarah whispered. "His wife can't have children. They want this baby, and they're not going to let anyone stand in their way." A heavy knock thundered against their front door, authoritative and impatient. Margaret looked at Thomas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. For 30 years they had lived in peaceful isolation, wanting nothing more than the child they could never have. Now that child had come to them, and with it a war they never could have imagined. The knocking came again, harder this time, and Margaret realized their simple life had just ended forever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the old cabin's timbers. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching Lily through the window as the young woman walked slowly through the snow-laden garden. There was something different about her movements today, less cautious, more deliberate, as if she'd made some internal decision during the long, sleepless night. Thomas emerged from the bedroom, his face drawn with exhaustion. He'd spent hours poring over the newspaper clippings they'd found in Lily's bag, cross-referencing dates and locations with an intensity that worried Sarah. The missing persons reports, the scattered mentions of a young woman seen in various towns across 3 states, all painted a picture that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "She's been running for months," Thomas said quietly, settling into the chair beside his wife. "Maybe longer. Look at this." He spread several clippings across the table. Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, all within the last 6 months. Always the same description, always someone asking questions about a pregnant woman traveling alone. Sarah studied the papers, her heart sinking with each headline. "But these aren't all police reports, Thomas. Some of these are different." She pointed to a small classified ad in a Colorado Springs paper. "This one's from a private investigator. And this," her finger traced another clipping. "Someone paid for this ad personally. Looking for my daughter, please come home. No questions asked." Before Thomas could respond, the kitchen door opened and Lily stepped inside, bringing with her the sharp scent of pine and snow. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes held a clarity that had been absent for days. "I heard you talking," she said simply, removing her borrowed coat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "I suppose it's time we had an honest conversation." Sarah felt her breath catch. Beside her, Thomas straightened in his chair, his weathered hands folding carefully on the table. The moment they'd both been dreading and anticipating had finally arrived. Lily moved to the window, her back to them as she spoke. "My name isn't Lily Morrison, it's Elizabeth Hartwell, and I've been running from my family for 8 months. Her voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders. "Not because they hurt me, not because they don't love me, because they love me too much." Thomas exchanged a glance with Sarah. This wasn't the confession either of them had expected. "My father is powerful, wealthy, used to getting his way." Elizabeth, Lily, turned to face them, her hands protectively cradling her belly. "When I told him I was pregnant, he had plans. The best doctors, the finest facilities, a future mapped out for his grandchild before it was even born. But the baby's father—" She paused, her composure wavering for the first time. "He was married, prominent in the community. My father saw scandal where I saw love, and he was determined to make it all disappear." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the younger woman, then stopped. "Disappear how?" "A quiet clinic in Switzerland. A new identity afterward. A trust fund to help me start over somewhere far from home." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "He called it protecting the family name. I called it erasing my child's existence before it had a chance to draw breath." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing this revelation. It wasn't what he'd feared, no violence, no crime in the traditional sense, but something more complex and heartbreaking. "So you ran," Sarah said softly. "I took everything I could carry and disappeared into the night like some character from a Gothic novel." Elizabeth moved to the table, sitting across from them. "I've been moving ever since, staying just ahead of his investigators, using cash when I could, false names when I had to. The baby's due in 6 weeks, and I've been trying to find somewhere safe to have it, somewhere he can't reach us. I was trying to reach a women's shelter in Denver. Someone had told me they could help with a new identity, legal protection. But the storm came up so fast, and I was so tired." She touched her forehead where the cut from the accident was healing. "I thought I was going to die out there. Both of us." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. After all their speculation, all their fears about who this woman might be and what she might bring into their lives, the truth was simpler and more devastating than either of them had imagined. Here was a daughter running from a father's love that had twisted into control, carrying a child whose future hung in the balance of that terrible family drama. The question now was what they would do with this knowledge, and whether their quiet mountain sanctuary could truly protect the small life growing within Elizabeth's body from the powerful forces pursuing them both. The photograph trembled in Martha's weathered hands as she studied the young woman's face captured in newsprint. Even in the grainy black and white image, there was no mistaking those delicate features, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her shoulders. Sarah Chen, missing for 3 weeks from Denver, last seen leaving her apartment building with a single suitcase. Pregnant runaway sought by family, the headline read, and beneath it, details that made Martha's stomach clench. Sarah wasn't just any runaway, she was the daughter of Dr. James Chen, a prominent Denver physician, and she'd disappeared after what the article described as a family disagreement regarding her pregnancy. Thomas stood behind Martha's chair, his large hands gripping the backrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. They'd found the newspaper in a stack of old kindling that Martha had retrieved from the cellar, yellowed pages from weeks past that somehow contained the answers to questions they'd been afraid to ask. "She lied to us," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything." Martha folded the newspaper carefully, her mind racing through every conversation they'd had with Sarah since pulling her from that snowbank. The tears when she'd claimed to have no family, the way she'd flinched whenever they mentioned contacting authorities, her insistence on staying hidden in their remote cabin. It all made terrible sense now. "Maybe she had good reason," Martha said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She wanted to believe in the girl who'd brought such unexpected warmth into their isolated world, who'd made Thomas smile for the first time in months, who'd given them both something to hope for again. "Good reason?" Thomas moved around the chair to face her. "Martha, her family is probably worried sick. They've been searching for her, and we've been harboring her like she's some kind of refugee. You read what it said, a family disagreement about her pregnancy. What if they wanted her to—" Martha couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that had occurred to her the moment she'd read those words. Thomas ran his hands through his graying hair. "We don't know anything for certain. We're just guessing." From upstairs came the soft sound of footsteps, and they both froze. Sarah had been napping, exhausted by another restless night, but apparently their voices had carried. Martha quickly shoved the newspaper into the drawer of the kitchen table, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the modest swell of her belly, the other trailing along the banister for support. She looked pale in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, and Martha noticed dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. "I heard voices," Sarah said, descending slowly. "Is everything all right?" Martha and Thomas exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken questions. Martha forced a smile, though it felt brittle on her face. "Of course, dear. Just discussing what to make for dinner." But Sarah's eyes were sharp, moving between them with an intelligence that Martha had always admired, and now found unsettling. The girl had survived alone in a blizzard, had somehow found her way to their remote cabin, had convinced them to take her in without asking too many questions. She was far from helpless. "You found something," Sarah said quietly, and it wasn't a question. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Outside, wind rattled the windows, a reminder of the storm that had brought them all together, and the isolation that now felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. Thomas stepped forward, his expression gentle but determined. "Sarah, we need to talk, really talk this time." Something flickered across Sarah's face, fear, resignation, or perhaps relief. She finished her descent and moved to the kitchen table, settling into the chair she'd claimed as her own over the past weeks. Her hands folded protectively over her belly. "I wondered when this day would come," she said. "I've been living on borrowed time, haven't I?" Martha pulled the newspaper from the drawer, smoothing it on the table between them. Sarah's eyes found her own image immediately, and her shoulders sagged as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks. "Dr. James Chen is your father," Martha said softly. "Yes." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "And you ran away because of the baby?" "Yes." Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't look away. "But not for the reason you're thinking. Not because they wanted me to end the pregnancy." She took a shaky breath. "Because they wanted to take my baby away from me." because they'd already arranged for someone else to raise it, someone they deemed more suitable than their unwed daughter. The words hung in the air like smoke, changing everything Martha thought she understood about their situation. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the old cabin. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Henry stared out the frost-etched window, his jaw working silently as he processed what they had learned. Emma was still sleeping, the pregnancy and emotional exhaustion having taken their toll. But her confessions from the night before hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dispel. "She's running from more than just an abusive husband," Margaret finally whispered, breaking the oppressive quiet. "Those men who came looking, they weren't collection agents." Henry's reflection in the window looked older than his 73 years. "Drug money. Has to be. And now she's led them right to our door." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. For 47 years, this cabin had been their sanctuary, a place where they'd weathered their own storms of grief and disappointment. The thought of it being violated, of violence finding its way up their mountain, made her feel sick. But then she remembered Emma's face when she'd spoken about the baby, the way her hand had protectively curved over her belly. There was genuine love there, fierce and maternal. Whatever darkness surrounded the girl, her feelings for her unborn child were pure. "We could call the sheriff," Henry said, his voice carefully neutral. He wasn't suggesting it, merely stating a possibility. "And tell him what? That we're harboring a pregnant woman whose husband might be involved in something illegal? They'd take her away, Henry. And that baby," Margaret's voice cracked, "that innocent baby would pay for its parents' mistakes." Henry turned from the window, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. In them, she saw her own conflict reflected, the war between self-preservation and the fierce protectiveness they'd never been able to direct toward a child of their own. "She's afraid they'll kill her," Margaret continued. "Did you see her face when she talked about running? That wasn't the fear of someone worried about legal trouble. That was the terror of someone running for her life." A soft sound from the bedroom made them both freeze. Emma appeared in the doorway, her dark hair tangled with sleep, one hand pressed to her lower back. She looked young and vulnerable in the morning light. But Margaret noticed how her eyes immediately catalogued the exits, how she positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the window. "I heard voices," Emma said quietly. "I thought maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. "Just us," Henry said, his voice gentler than it had been the night before. "How are you feeling?" Emma's hand moved to her belly in that unconscious gesture Margaret had seen countless times. "The baby's active this morning. I think all the stress yesterday—" She trailed off, studying their faces. "You've been talking about what I told you." It wasn't a question, and Margaret appreciated the girl's directness. "We're trying to understand what we're dealing with," she admitted. "Those men who came here, they'll be back, won't they?" Emma sank into the remaining kitchen chair, her shoulders sagging. "Maybe. Probably. Derek doesn't give up easily, and if he thinks I took something—" She shook her head. "I should go. I should have left this morning. I never meant to put you in danger." "Where would you go?" Henry asked, surprising Margaret with a concern in his voice. "The roads are still impassable, and even when they clear, you said yourself you don't have anywhere safe." Emma's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know. I've been running for 3 months, just trying to stay ahead of them long enough for the baby to be born. After that—" She shrugged helplessly. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a protective instinct she'd thought had died with their last failed pregnancy. What if you didn't have to run anymore? Both Henry and Emma stared at her. She could see the warning in her husband's eyes, but she pressed on. "What if we could find a way to end this? To make it so they stopped looking for you?" Emma shook her head quickly. "You don't understand what kind of people these are. Derek, his associates, they don't just forget about $30,000. 30,000? Henry's eyebrows shot up. "Is that what they think you took?" "It's what I did take," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Derek's safe. I knew I'd need money to disappear, to start over somewhere. I didn't think about the consequences, about who might get hurt. Margaret reached across the table and covered Emma's hand with her own. The girl's skin was cold, and Margaret could feel the tremor of fear running through her. "Then we find a way to give it back," she said simply, "and we make sure they leave you alone permanently." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of snow sliding from the roof. The wind howled against the cabin walls like a living thing, but inside, the silence between Frank and Margaret had grown even more deafening. 3 days had passed since Sarah's confession about the fire, and the weight of her words had settled over them like ash from a burned-out hearth. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the bedroom door where Sarah rested. The girl had barely spoken since that night, emerging only for meals and retreating again like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her pregnancy had become more pronounced, the curve of her belly a constant reminder of the life growing within her, a life conceived in violence and carried in terror. "She's eating again," Frank said quietly, settling into the chair across from his wife. He'd taken to watching Sarah's every movement, noting the small signs of recovery like a doctor monitoring a patient's vital signs. "Saw her take some of those crackers you left for her." Margaret nodded absently. "The baby needs nourishment." Her voice carried no warmth, only the mechanical concern of someone going through the motions of care, regardless of everything else. Frank studied his wife's profile, seeing decades of accumulated sorrow etched in the lines around her eyes. They'd built their marriage on shared grief, finding solace in their mutual loss. But Sarah's presence had cracked something open that they'd kept carefully sealed. The possibility of hope was perhaps more terrifying than despair had ever been. "I've been thinking," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about what she said, about running." Margaret's head snapped toward him. "Frank!" "No, listen." He leaned forward, his calloused hands flat on the table. "That man she described, the one who hurt her. Men like that don't just let someone disappear. They hunt." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret felt her chest tighten as the implications settled over her. "You think he'll come looking?" "I think we need to be prepared for that possibility." Frank's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as he spoke. "This isn't just about giving her shelter anymore, Maggie. This is about protecting her. Protecting the baby." Margaret rose abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness that had been their sanctuary for so many years. Now it felt like a trap, beautiful but isolated, far from help if help was needed. "We don't even know her real name," she said, her breath fogging the glass. "Don't know where she's really from or who might be looking for her. For all we know, we could be harboring a criminal. Do you believe that?" Frank's question was quiet but direct. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the raw terror in Sarah's voice, the way she'd flinched at every unexpected sound during her first weeks with them. "No, but believing and knowing aren't the same thing." Behind them, the bedroom door creaked open. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her hand resting protectively over her belly, her face pale but determined. "I heard you talking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about him coming." Frank and Margaret exchanged glances. There was no point in pretending now. "Sarah," Margaret said gently, turning from the window, "we need to know more. If we're going to help you, really help you, we need the truth, all of it." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, her free hand gripping the doorframe for support. "I can't ask you to do more than you already have. If Marcus finds me here, finds you—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Marcus," Frank repeated, filing the name away. It was the first concrete detail she'd given about her pursuer. "He has money," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was giving her power back. "Connections. He's used to getting what he wants, and he wanted me to disappear quietly. When I ran instead," she shuddered, He won't stop looking. Men like Marcus never do. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a protective instinct she hadn't felt in decades. Then we make sure he doesn't find you. Frank looked at his wife in surprise. The decisive tone in her voice was one he remembered from their younger days, before loss had made her cautious and withdrawn. The storm season's just beginning, Margaret continued, moving toward Sarah with purposeful steps. No one's getting up this mountain for weeks, maybe months. That gives us time to plan, to figure out what comes next. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why would you risk everything for someone like me? Margaret reached out, her hand hovering over Sarah's belly before settling there gently. Because, she said simply, some things are worth the risk. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every footstep crunch like broken glass. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas trudge through knee-deep snow toward the barn, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. 3 days had elapsed since Sarah's confession, and the weight of her words hung between them like an unspoken verdict. Sarah remained upstairs, claiming exhaustion, though Margaret suspected shame kept her sequestered. The girl emerged only for meals, her eyes red-rimmed and avoiding contact, her hands perpetually cradling the swell of her belly as if protecting the child from the truth she'd finally voiced. Thomas entered through the mudroom, stamping snow from his boots with unusual force. Margaret turned from the window, noting the tight line of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried tension like a yoke. "Coffee's fresh," she offered. He nodded, hanging his coat on the wooden peg their grandfather had carved 60 years ago. Everything in this house held memory, held permanence, everything except the young woman upstairs who'd shattered their careful peace with her desperate honesty. "Roads still blocked?" Margaret asked, though she knew the answer. "County won't get the plow up here for another day, maybe 2. Thomas poured coffee into his favorite mug, the one with the hairline crack that had been growing imperceptibly wider for 15 years. Even then, with this much snow, he didn't finish. They both understood. Sarah wasn't going anywhere soon, and neither were the complications she'd brought into their lives. Margaret busied herself kneading bread dough, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. "We need to talk about what she told us." Thomas leaned against the counter, studying his wife's profile. After 43 years of marriage, he could read the subtle signs of her internal struggle. The slight downturn of her mouth meant she was wrestling with something that challenged her fundamental beliefs. The way she pressed harder into the dough suggested anger she couldn't quite acknowledge. "She killed someone, Margaret." She defended herself. The words came sharp, defensive. Margaret paused in her kneading, surprised by her own vehemence. "That's not what the law will see." The law. Margaret's voice carried decades of mountain skepticism toward outside authority. The law that would have let that man continue hurting her? The law that fails women every day? Thomas set down his mug. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about the children they'd never had, the family they'd never been able to create, and the unexpected chance fate had delivered to their doorstep wrapped in snow and desperation. "She lied to us," he said quietly. "She survived." Margaret turned to face him fully. "There's a difference." Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Sarah was moving around, probably listening to their muffled conversation, trying to divine her fate from the tone of their voices. "What are you saying?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Margaret wiped flour from her hands with deliberate care. "I'm saying that girl is carrying a baby. Our baby, if we choose it, and sometimes protecting family means accepting uncomfortable truths." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and fears. Thomas thought about the nursery they'd prepared 3 times in their early marriage, each time having to dismantle it when hope died. He thought about the small graves in the town cemetery, the children who'd lived only hours or days before slipping away. "If we help her," he said slowly, "if we hide what she's done, we become part of it." "We already are part of it." Margaret's voice carried quiet certainty. The moment we pulled her from that snowdrift, the moment we brought her into our home, we became responsible. Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the pristine landscape that had isolated them from the world for decades. That isolation had been both blessing and curse. It had protected them from the constant reminder of other people's children, other people's families. But it had also preserved them, kept their hearts intact despite repeated breaking. "She trusts us," Margaret continued. "For the first time in probably years, that girl has someone who isn't trying to hurt her or use her. She's asking us to be family, by lying for her, by choosing love over law." The distinction hung in the air like incense, sacred and troubling. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing down like the snow outside. When he opened them again, Margaret was watching him with the same expression she'd worn 43 years ago, when they'd promised to face whatever came together. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sarah appeared in the doorway, pale but determined, her dark hair falling around her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind if needed. "I'll leave," she said simply. "As soon as the road's clear. You don't have to choose." Margaret and Thomas exchanged a look that contained decades of shared understanding, shared loss, and perhaps, finally, shared hope. "No," Margaret said, her voice steady as stone. "You won't." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every shallow breath. Sarah sat hunched over the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the phone as if it might spontaneously combust. The weight of Detective Morrison's words still pressed against her chest like a physical force. 3 women, all pregnant, all missing. Thomas moved through the cabin with the careful precision of a man walking on thin ice, checking locks, peering through curtains, his weathered hands never straying far from the shotgun he'd retrieved from the hall closet. The weapon looked foreign in their peaceful home, an intrusion of violence into decades of quiet contentment. "She's still sleeping," he whispered, settling into the chair across from Sarah. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a sound that had always been comforting but now seemed ominous, announcing their every movement to whoever might be listening. Sarah nodded, unable to find words. Upstairs, Elena rested in what had been their nursery, the room they'd prepared 40 years ago with such hope, such certainty that their family would grow within these walls. Now it housed a stranger, carrying secrets that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew about love, about loss, about the cruel mathematics of fate. "The detective said they'd send someone up here," Thomas continued, his voice barely audible. "Roads are still impassable, but they're working on it. What if—" Sarah's voice cracked. She cleared her throat, tried again. "What if we're protecting the wrong person?" The question hung between them like smoke. Thomas reached across the table, his calloused fingers finding hers. After 52 years of marriage, they'd developed their own language of touches, glances, silences that spoke volumes. This touch carried the weight of shared doubt, shared fear. A sound from upstairs made them both freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate. Elena was awake. They listened as she moved across the floor above them, heard the soft squeak of the bathroom door, the whisper of water through old pipes. Normal sounds that now felt loaded with menace. Sarah found herself cataloguing the knives in the kitchen drawer, the distance to the back door, escape routes she'd never considered in 5 decades of living in this sanctuary. "We have to ask her," Thomas said quietly. "We have to know." Before Sarah could respond, Elena appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She moved carefully, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other trailing along the banister. In the afternoon light filtering through the windows, she looked impossibly young, vulnerable in a way that made Sarah's maternal instincts war with her newfound suspicions. "I heard voices," Elena said, settling into the chair they'd pulled up for her. "Is everything all right?" Sarah and Thomas exchanged a look. 52 years of marriage compressed into a single glance, a wordless negotiation about who would speak first, how much to reveal. whether to trust their hearts or their heads. Elena, Sarah began, then stopped. The name felt different now, possibly false, another piece in a puzzle they didn't understand. The police called. The young woman's face went very still, but Sarah caught something in her eyes. Not surprise, but resignation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "They're looking for you," Thomas added gently. "You and others." Elena's hand moved protectively to her belly, a gesture Sarah recognized from her own phantom pregnancies, the way hope manifested in protective touches over empty wombs. But now, the gesture carried different weight. Not hope, but fear. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Elena whispered, and Sarah's heart clenched at the admission hidden in those words. Never wanted implied that hurt had indeed occurred, that their rescued angel might be something else entirely. "Tell us," Sarah said, leaning forward. "Tell us what happened." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows with icy fingers. The sound reminded them all of the storm that had brought Elena to their door, the blizzard that had seemed like providence, but might have been something far more sinister. Elena looked between them, these two people who'd shown her nothing but kindness, who'd opened their home and their hearts without question. Her eyes filled with tears that caught the light like fractured diamonds. "There's a man," she began, her voice so quiet they had to strain to hear. "He finds girls like me, girls with nowhere else to go. He promises us homes, families, a future for our babies." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water. "But the families he finds, they don't want to wait for adoption paperwork. They don't want questions, or complications, or the chance that we might change our minds." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in their home for decades, counting down moments toward some inevitable reckoning they were only beginning to understand. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls had crept inward during the night. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Through the frost-etched window, she could see Henry splitting wood with mechanical precision, each swing of the axe carrying the weight of their shattered trust. 3 days had passed since they discovered the truth about Sarah. 3 days of careful conversations and stolen glances, of sleeping on opposite sides of their bed with an ocean of silence between them. The pregnant woman remained in their guest room, claiming she was too weak to travel, though Eleanor suspected she was buying time to weave new lies. The floorboards above creaked, and Eleanor's jaw tightened. Sarah was awake. Soon she would pad down the stairs with that careful, practiced vulnerability, touching her rounded belly like a talisman, reminding them of the precious life she carried. The life that might be the key to everything they'd ever wanted, if only they could trust a single word from her mouth. Eleanor had called the sheriff's office yesterday, but the storm had knocked out several phone lines in the valley. Deputy Morrison wouldn't be able to make it up the mountain for at least another day, maybe 2. Until then, they were trapped in this triangle of suspicion and desperate hope. The kitchen door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and Henry's familiar scent of pine and honest sweat. He stamped his boots and hung his coat on the hook, avoiding her eyes as he had for days now. "Wood stacked," he said simply, moving to the sink to wash his hands. "Henry," Eleanor's voice was softer than she'd intended. "We need to decide what we're going to do." He turned, his blue eyes tired but still sharp. "What's to decide?" "We wait for Morrison, tell him what we found, and let the law sort it out. And the baby." The question hung between them like smoke. Henry's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked every one of his 67 years. "Eleanor, we can't build our happiness on someone else's misery. We can't pretend that girl is something she's not just because we want it so badly. But what if she's telling the truth now? What if Marcus Holloway really was abusive? What if she's playing us like a fiddle?" Henry's voice rose slightly, then he caught himself, glancing toward the stairs. "You didn't see what I saw in that bag, Eleanor. The fake IDs, the cash, the pills with someone else's name on them. That's not the behavior of an innocent woman. Eleanor stood, her chair scraping against the floor. People do desperate things when they're desperate, Henry. Maybe she was running from something worse than we can imagine. Before Henry could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced Sarah's arrival. She appeared in the doorway wearing Eleanor's blue robe, her dark hair tousled, one hand supporting her lower back in that universal gesture of pregnancy. Her eyes darted between them, reading the tension with practiced ease. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small. "I couldn't help but overhear. I know you don't trust me anymore, and I don't blame you. But I need to tell you something else, something I should have said before." Eleanor felt Henry's warning gaze but ignored it. "What is it, dear?" Sarah moved carefully to the table, settling into the chair with visible relief. The money, the fake IDs, they weren't mine. They belonged to Marcus. He was involved in things, bad things. Money laundering, I think, maybe worse. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, I took the bag because I thought it just had clothes in it. I didn't discover what else was inside until I was already on the road. "Convenient," Henry muttered. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been genuine anger. "You think this is convenient? You think being pregnant and alone and hunted is something I chose? I loved Marcus once. I thought I could help him, change him. But love doesn't fix a man who enjoys hurting people." She pushed up the sleeves of the robe, revealing faded yellow bruises on her forearms. "These are the light ones, the ones that are almost healed. You want to see the rest?" Eleanor reached toward her instinctively, but Henry stepped forward. "Bruises can be faked. Stories can be rehearsed. We're simple people, Sarah, but we're not stupid." "I know," Sarah's voice broke slightly. "And I know I've given you no reason to believe me. But this baby," she pressed both hands to her stomach, "this baby deserves better than the life I can give it alone. I was hoping, praying that maybe you might consider—" "No," Henry's voice was firm. "We won't be part of whatever game you're playing." But Eleanor saw something in Sarah's eyes then, a flicker of genuine fear that made her chest tighten. Outside, the wind was picking up again, and she wondered if another storm was coming. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt more ominous than the howling wind. Martha sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Through the frost-etched window, she could see Samuel's footprints leading toward the barn, where he'd been for the past hour, ostensibly checking on the animals but really avoiding the conversation they both knew was coming. Elena remained upstairs, claiming exhaustion, though Martha suspected the girl was listening to every creak of the floorboards, every whispered word that might reveal her fate. The blood on the towels had been real enough, as had the panic in her eyes when she'd begged them not to call for help. But the story about the abusive boyfriend felt as thin as ice over a deep pond. Martha had delivered enough babies in her younger days to know what a miscarriage looked like, and Elena's symptoms didn't match. The cramping had been too brief, the bleeding too light, and there was something theatrical about the way she'd clutched her stomach. More troubling still was what Martha had found when she'd gone to wash the stained towels. The blood had already begun to separate, as if it had been sitting in a container rather than flowing fresh from a wound. The kitchen door opened with a gust of cold air, and Samuel stamped his boots on the threshold. His face was grim, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been that morning. "Well?" Martha asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Checked the radio while I was out there," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "There's been developments." Martha's stomach tightened. "What kind of developments?" "They found a body up near Miller's Ridge. Young man, early 30s, shot twice in the chest and left in a ravine." Samuel's voice was carefully neutral, but Martha could hear the strain beneath it. "The description matches what Elena told us about her boyfriend." "Dear God!" Martha set down her cup with shaking hands. "Then she was telling the truth?" "About some of it, maybe." Samuel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "But there's more. They're looking for a woman in connection with the murder. Pregnant woman, goes by the name Elena Vasquez, though they suspect that's an alias." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Martha found herself thinking of the past 3 days, of Elena's gentle smile and the way her hand curved protectively over her belly. The soft conversations they'd shared about babies and futures and hope. Had it all been an elaborate performance? Missing how? Disappeared 6 months ago with a considerable sum of money that didn't belong to her. The family's been searching ever since. Samuel rubbed his temples. Martha, I think we've been harboring a fugitive. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Both of them froze, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. What are we going to do? Martha whispered. Before Samuel could answer, they heard the soft pad of footsteps on the stairs. Elena appeared in the doorway, no longer the fragile victim who'd collapsed in their living room. Her posture was straighter, her eyes alert and calculating. In her hand, she held Samuel's hunting rifle. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," she said, her voice steady despite the weapon she carried. "You've been so kind to me. I really didn't want it to come to this." Samuel slowly pushed back his chair, but Elena raised the rifle slightly, and he froze. "Don't," she said. "Please. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. You have to understand. I did what I did for my baby. Everything I did was for my baby." "The private investigator," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "You killed him. He was going to take my child away from me. Give it back to people who never wanted me, who treated me like an incubator for their precious heir." Elena's grip on the rifle tightened. "I won't let that happen. This baby is mine." "Elena, listen to me," Samuel said carefully. "Whatever happened before, whatever you did, we can work through this. You don't have to run anymore." "You're going to help me whether you want to or not," Elena replied. "I need supplies, and I need your truck. After the road's clear, you're going to drive me to the train station in Cedar Falls. If you cooperate, if you don't try anything stupid, I'll disappear and you'll never see me again." Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a profound sadness. For 3 days she'd allowed herself to believe in miracles again, to imagine that God had sent them the child they'd always wanted. Now that dream was crumbling like snow in the spring sun. Storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt more ominous than the howling winds. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Thomas trudge through the deep snow toward the barn. His shoulders were hunched against more than just the cold. The weight of Sarah's revelation had settled on all of them like a second blizzard. Inside the house, Sarah sat curled on the couch, one hand resting protectively on her belly. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows, but new marks had appeared in the form of dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept since confessing the truth about David, about the money, about the dangerous man who would eventually come looking for both. "He doesn't believe me," Sarah said quietly, when Margaret returned to the living room with 2 steaming mugs of tea. Margaret settled into her chair, the same one she'd occupied through countless lonely evenings over the decades. "Thomas needs time. We both do. You think I'm lying too?" "I think you're scared." Margaret's voice held no judgment, only the kind of understanding that came from a lifetime of disappointment. Fear makes people do terrible things. It also makes them see terrible things where they might not exist. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You think I imagined David stealing from those people? That I imagined Marcus threatening to kill us both? I think you loved someone who turned out to be different than you thought. That's not a crime, child." Through the window, they could see Thomas emerging from the barn, his breath visible in sharp puffs. He'd been spending more time out there lately, claiming to check on the animals, but really just avoiding the tension that had settled over their home like smoke. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, wincing as the baby kicked. "I keep thinking about what you told me, about the baby you lost, how you blamed yourself." Margaret's cup rattled against its saucer. She'd shared that story in a moment of connection, when Sarah had been just a pregnant stranger in need of comfort. Now it felt like ammunition in the wrong hands. That was different. Was it? "You said you wondered every day what you could have done differently." That's all I've been doing since David died, wondering if I could have stopped him, if I could have made him give the money back, if I should have run sooner." Thomas stamped his boots on the porch before entering, bringing with him the sharp scent of winter air. His eyes moved between the two women, searching for signs of whatever conversation he'd interrupted. "Road's still blocked," he announced, though they all knew he hadn't walked far enough to check. "Probably be another day or two before the county gets a plow up here." The words hung in the air with their unspoken implication. Another day or two of this strange limbo, of pretending they were still just good Samaritans helping a stranded traveler rather than three people bound together by secrets and desperation. Sarah struggled to stand, her pregnancy making the simple movement awkward. "I should pack my things. When the road opens, I'll go." "You've both done enough. Sit down," Thomas said, his tone sharper than usual. "Damn fool woman. Where do you think you're going to go in your condition?" The unexpected vehemence in his voice surprised all three of them. Margaret watched her husband's face, seeing something there she hadn't witnessed in years, a fierce protectiveness that reminded her of the man who'd once promised to shield her from every hurt. "You think I want to stay?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You think I enjoy knowing that I've brought danger to the only people who've shown me kindness? But David was right about one thing. I don't have anywhere else to go." Thomas moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. In the distance, the mountains rose like silent sentinels, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. "Margaret, remember that winter we got snowed in for 3 weeks? Second year we were married." "I remember. We nearly killed each other by the end of it. All that time trapped together, nothing to do but talk and think and worry about things we couldn't control." He turned back to face them. "But we came through it. Stronger, maybe." Sarah looked between them, confusion evident in her expression. "I don't understand." "He's saying we don't abandon people," Margaret said softly. "It's not who we are. Even if everything I've told you is true, even if Marcus does come looking." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But we don't turn out a pregnant woman in winter. We just don't." Outside, fresh snow had begun to fall again, each flake catching the light like a tiny star before disappearing into the growing drifts. The mountain would keep its secrets a little longer. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to hold the entire mountain in its grip. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching the first light of dawn paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Behind her, she could hear Margaret moving about the cabin, the soft sounds of someone trying to pack quietly. "You don't have to leave," Eleanor said without turning around. Margaret's hand stilled on the small duffel bag Harold had found for her. "I think we both know I do." Eleanor finally turned, taking in the young woman's pale face, the way she held herself as if prepared to flee at any moment. 3 days had passed since Margaret's confession about the fire, about the family she'd failed to save, about the guilt that had driven her to this isolated place. 3 days of careful conversations and shared silences, of Harold splitting wood with unusual vigor, while Eleanor found herself staring into the distance more often than not. "Harold's hitching up the truck," Margaret continued, folding the flannel shirt Eleanor had given her. "He said the road should be passable now. The roads have been passable since yesterday." Eleanor moved closer, her weathered hands finding the back of a chair. "We've been waiting for you to decide." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Decide what? Whether to stay and bring more destruction to the only people who've shown me kindness in months? Whether to let you and Harold get attached to someone who's poison to everything she touches?" "You're not poison." The words came out sharper than Eleanor intended. "You're a woman who made a terrible mistake, who's been running from it ever since. 5 people died because of me." Margaret's voice cracked. A mother, a father, 3 children. The youngest was barely 2 years old. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, remembering her own devastating losses. The pregnancies that never came to term, the dreams that died a little more with each passing year. "And how many people have you saved since then?" How many lives have you delivered into this world? That doesn't balance the scales. Maybe the scales don't need balancing. Maybe they need breaking. Harold's boots stamped on the porch, and both women fell silent as he entered, bringing the scent of cold air and pine. His eyes moved between them, reading the tension with the intuition of a man who'd spent 43 years learning his wife's moods. "Truck's ready," he said simply. Margaret nodded, shouldering her bag. "Thank you, both of you, for everything." But as she moved toward the door, Eleanor stepped into her path. "What happened to forgiveness?" "What?" "That first night, when Harold found you, you were talking in your sleep about forgiveness, about whether some things are too broken to fix." Eleanor's voice grew gentler. "I've been thinking about that, about the babies Harold and I never had, about the bitterness I carried for so many years, blaming God, blaming myself, blaming him sometimes when the loneliness got too sharp." Harold's expression softened, old pain flickering across his features. "I thought forgiveness was something you had to earn," Eleanor continued. "Something that came after you'd suffered enough, after you'd made amends. But that night, watching Harold carry you in from the storm, I realized something. Sometimes forgiveness is just a choice to stop carrying the weight." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I can't just choose to forget what I did. Not forget, but maybe stop letting it be the only thing that defines you." Eleanor reached out, covering Margaret's free hand with both of hers. "That baby you're carrying, do you want them to grow up hearing about the fire or about the midwife who helped bring them and dozens of other children safely into the world?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Outside, a bird began to sing, its voice clear and sweet in the crisp air. Harold cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know." He looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "The spare room upstairs. We built it as a nursery years ago, never had reason to use it for that, but we kept hoping. Even painted it yellow, since we never knew." He trailed off, but Margaret understood. The room where she'd been sleeping, with its simple furniture and cheerful walls, had been prepared for the children who never came. "We're not asking you to replace what we lost," Eleanor said, "and we can't replace what you lost either. But maybe, together, we can build something new, something that honors the past without being trapped by it." Margaret set down her bag, one hand moving instinctively to her growing belly. Through the window, the mountain peaks caught the full light of the rising sun, no longer stark and forbidding, but beautiful in their rugged permanence. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Harold and Eleanor exchanged a look that contained 4 decades of shared sorrow and enduring love. "We're sure," Eleanor said. Outside, the snow began to melt.